Hello, everyone. This is Sarah from Hamilton. Today, after being on hiatus for a couple of months, we are back with Ken Griffith to bring our series on the reconstruction of ancient history within the framework of biblical chronology to its conclusion. We are aware that Egyptologist David Falk of Ancient Egypt and the Bible has done a popcorn review of one of our early discussions, and we are in the process of preparing a response to the criticisms that he made in that video. Those responses will be uploaded after the conclusion of our own positive construction of ancient history in relation to biblical chronology. Also, if you are interested in supporting this channel, please consider becoming a patron. You can also buy my book through Amazon, Christ in All Things, Essays on Scripture and Theology, at the link in the pinned comment, as well as sign up for my course and lecture recordings, Answering Judaism's Rejection of Jesus, also in the pinned comment. With that said, let's get into today's discussion, which is on the closing days of Egyptian history, or in this revised chronological framework, Dynasties 20 and 21. So Ken, thank you so much for coming on, and welcome back.
Thank you.
So conventional scholars identify Manetho's 20th and 21st dynasties as spanning the 13th to the 10th centuries before Christ. You have placed them in the 4th to the 3rd centuries before Christ, meaning this is the most staggering disjunction between the conventional chronology and your revised interpretation of history. So would you just go into how this mistake occurred in the placement of these dynasties and what your reasoning is for placing them as late as you do in the context that you do?
Sure. As we've discussed previously, Manetho listed his dynasties by city. So Dynasty 20 was based in Thebes in his list, and therefore, logically, it should follow after Dynasty 19, which is also based in Thebes. We have dated Dynasty 19 to be contemporary with the late Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, and it was effectively ended by Cambyses the Persian in 525 BC. So Egypt revolted against their Persian overlords several times, but in 404 BC, a king named Amyrtaeus finally gained independence because Persia was distracted by a civil war because they had a pretender to the throne, being the younger brother Cyrus, who was basically contesting the throne after the death of Darius II. So basically, the Egyptians got their freedom, but then the Persian emperors made several attempts to reconquer it over the following 70 years, and they finally succeeded about 10 years before Alexander the Great liberated Egypt. So those invasion attempts are chronicled in the reigns of Nectanebo I and II in the Greek histories. Now, Velikovsky pointed out that the account of Ramses III defending Egypt, and this is basically a drawing of his depiction at the temple at Medinet Habu, he basically shows himself fighting this group called the Peliset or Paraset, as well as sea peoples. And Velikovsky went through step by step, showing that the depictions by Ramses III match very closely the description of the battles of Nectanebo I against the Persians. So in addition to the historical details, you have a number of language and scripts found from Dynasty 20 that seem to match the Greek classical era. For example, you find Hebrew and Aramaic words in the inscriptions of Ramses III, when Aramaic was unknown in 1100 BC, when supposedly the 20th dynasty actually reigned. On the back of the tiles from the temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu were found classical Greek letters, not Mycenaean linear B letters. Again, that puts it down in the classical era. In my view, the 20th dynasty is the one that Emanuel Velikovsky actually got the most right out of all of his books. The Peoples of the Sea is probably one of his most accurate ones. And we found a few points that do seem to strengthen his argument.
I think one of the things that many people are going to, or many historians would say here, is that Okay, the Persian period in Egyptian history is already covered by dynasties 27 to 31. Velikovsky was quite fond of the idea of alter egos, that certain dynasties were actually just duplicated and counted twice. What's your approach to this problem? What is the relationship, to the extent that there is one, between your construction of dynasties 20 and 21 to Manetho's dynasties 27 to 31?
Well, there's actually two different issues going on. One is that Manetho sometimes lists the same man as a king in different dynasties because the dynasties are by city. And so if um, one ruler actually ruled more than one city, he may have ended up being listed in the dynasties of both cities. Okay, so we saw that with dynasties 19 and 26. Um, Another issue, a second issue, is that when the Ethiopians conquered Egypt, which is called the 25th dynasty, they were kings of a kingdom called Napata down in what's today Sudan. It was considered the kingdom of Kush by the Greeks. And they viewed themselves as kings of two countries. So these 25th dynasty kings, they had two sets of titlatures. They also wore a uraeus, which is the cobra on the front of the pharaoh's crown. They had a double uraeus to symbolize that they were the kings of two countries. Um, and what we discussed in our previous episode about this was that we believe that Dynasty 26 basically continued that tradition, and that's why you have the 19th dynasty with one set of titles, and then the 26th dynasty at the same time, sometimes the same man, sometimes not, but when it is the same man, he has a complete different set of titles in this dynasty than he does in the other. Um, so the 20th dynasty comes to the throne. They basically expelled the Persians, or we view it, they expelled somebody. They claimed that they expelled the Asiatics, the first king of the 20th dynasty. So who were the Asiatics? The leader of the Asiatics is called Irsu, and we believe he was the Persian satrap Arsames, and so you've got his name preserved there pretty accurately. So the 20th dynasty are trying to regain the lost glory of the 19th dynasty. And therefore, one possibility is that they are using the same practice where they've got their lower Egyptian throne name and their upper Egyptian throne name, and a full different set of titles. So that's one possibility. That's the possibility that Velikovsky argued for. The other possibility is that there were actually several different kings in different parts of Egypt after they gained independence from the Persians. And then you had two different kings, one named Ramses III and one who's named Necho the First. So it's hard to have enough data right now to prove one or the other. I lean toward Velikovsky's answer that basically Necho was using a different set of titulature in Thebes, and that's where his tomb was, and that's also where his temple at Medinet Habu was. So we're basically finding the entire story told from using that set of titles as opposed to his lower Egyptian set of titles.
And I think in the Egyptian sources, the foe of Ramses III, he is his personal name is given as Arza, or something like that, which compares quite well to the Persian satrap over Egypt in this period. Um, so, so this period in Egyptian history is probably the most well known within conventional history because it marks the arrival of the so-called Sea Peoples. And because this dynasty is usually placed at the time of the early monarchy of Israel, the arrival of the Sea Peoples, as well as the Peliset, whom you've identified as the Persians, is conventionally connected to the rise of the Philistines. So you've identified the Peliset as the Persians. Would you tell us who you think, to the extent that we can identify them, the Sea Peoples are that are identified in the Egyptian records from this time.
Yes. So remember that the Sea Peoples actually first are recorded in the reign of Merneptah, um, and possibly even earlier, as early as Seti. But Merneptah has a long inscription. I think it's the Israel stele inscription. And let's go down here. So he lists most of the same tribes as the people of the sea that Ramses III lists as the people of the sea. And these are identifiable. So we'll start with Merneptah's. The Teresh appear to be from the city of Tarsus. The Luca are the Lycians. The Sheridan are from the city of Sardis and Lydia, although some people say they're the Sardinians. Um, but the Sardinians claimed that they were founded by a woman from Sardis and Lydia, so they're basically claiming the same culture and name. The Shekelesh appears to be the city of Sagalassos. And now we come down to Ramses III, his tribes that are called peoples of the sea. You've got the Checker, it's hard to pronounce, Checker, who appear to be Teucrian Greeks, Greeks descended from Teucer, and they were from the area of Salamis and Athens. The Shekelesh are the Sagalassos again, Teresh, Tarsus. The Wishesh is another little city called Issos in Turkey. And again, you've got the Sardan, the same as the Sheridan, who are basically the Sardis Lydians. And you had around this time a Persian satrapy in Anatolia that was called those of the sea, which implies to me that it's not just the Egyptians who were calling them peoples of the sea, that the Persians also referred to these tribes. Here's a little map. This ignore these lines those are just trade routes from the map I used, but the Tajeker would come from this area of Greece, the Sardin, the Luca, the Shekelesh coming from Sagalassos, the Teresh coming from Tarsus, and the Wishesh coming from Issus. And those are identifiable tribes, and those are identifiable in the classical Greek era of it was basically the century after the Persian War. So,
So I think uh, this reconstruction was kind of spelled out by Velikovsky in what is sequentially the third volume of his set, Peoples of the Sea, but it was published as a second volume. It met with, I think, a relatively positive reception, but it was the placement of Dynasty 19 in the 7th century, which marked then a departure of most of his former disciples from the Velikovsky chronology. And many of the criticisms that they raised of his placement of Dynasty 19 were archaeological, and those were then applied to his placement of dynasties 20 and 21. So could you explore some of the archaeological challenges to the placement of dynasties 20 and 21 in the Persian period, the context in which we find, pharaonic seals and evidence of their reigns within the archaeological record, and explore why you think these do not decisively mitigate, at the very least, against your placement of these dynasties?
okay, I'll do my best. um, it all goes back to the Elamarna letters. Um, in the Elamarna letters, you have correspondence with a king Ashur-uballit, who is claiming to be king of Assyria, who is assumed to be Ashur-uballit the first of us in the Assyrian king list. The second issue is that you have Asukaluliumis the first, who is assumed to be the same Suppiluliumis. He's a Hittite king who's corresponding with the pharaoh in the EA letters, and he's assumed to be the same one that later was the New Kingdom, basically the New Kingdom Hittites. And so those two arguments seem to peg the basically the Amarna era way back to about 1300 BC and later. What we found was, and what others have argued before us, was that the Ashur-uballit, who was writing um, to Akhenaten, he was not the Ashur-uballit the first. He's a non-canonical Ashur-uballit who was probably the king of the city of Haran, which had been established apparently kind of like a cadet dynasty of the Assyrians had been established there by Shalmaneser I, and that he actually dates to the time of the the reign of basically a little bit before Shalmaneser III, maybe a generation before him, maybe 2 generations before him. The second issue with the Suppiluliumis is that we found that there are in the Assyrian records several more men named Suppiluliumis who are kings who are being mentioned in the Assyrian annals, and that they conflated, basically the archaeologists have conflated Suppiluliumis the first with a different Suppiluliumis who was about 2 centuries earlier, who was the one who corresponded with Akhenaten. So once you tease apart those people who've been smashed together into one person who were actually 2 different people who reigned at different times, that removes the main objection that Velikovsky's followers, such as David Rohl and Peter James, raised, and the reason that they ended up rejecting his gap between Akhenaten and the 19th dynasty. And we talked about in previous episode the evidence that the great king of Hatti that Ramses II was corresponding with was Cyaxares the Great, king of the Medes, and that his name is even recorded in the Treaty of Kadesh as Kedazar. Well, once you start recognizing the number of very strong synchronisms between the 19th dynasty and the Medes, then moving the 20th dynasty down to follow it is actually relatively simple. There aren't really many very strong arguments against the 20th dynasty placement, except for one raised by a guy, not Lee Iacocca, a guy named Iacco published a paper in Answers Research Journal, and sorry, he tried to refute the David Downs use of Velikovsky's placement of the 20th dynasty by arguing from the city of Lachish, I'm probably pronouncing wrong, that dynasties of Ramses III and Ramses IV were found in these in level 6, which was way below the Assyrian and the Babylonian destruction layers, and therefore that would require that Ramses III and IV must have lived before the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of Lachish by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And that would seem to refute the idea that Velikovsky is advancing, saying that actually Ramses III and IV were down here in the between 400 and 300 BC. So,
And I think I haven't read the paper to which you're referring, but the layer, if I'm remembering correctly, the layer that is conventionally identified as the Babylonian destruction layer at Lachish is dated in relation to the Lachish letters. And I think Peter James in Centuries of Darkness actually redates that to the Persian period and argues that the placement of the Lachish letters in the Babylonian context was unwarranted, and that even conventional scholars have pretty much abandoned all the arguments for that, even though they still place it in the Babylonian period. So I just read that the other day, so I don't know if that's relevant or not, but it's something which strikes.
well, it is relevant because one of the problems that I'm gonna argue whose cartouches these were, and one of the problems is if this was the Assyrian destruction layer, it still seems too far back. But if this is the Persian destruction layer, then this is the Babylonian and this is the Assyrian, then it's perfect. It actually fits perfectly. Let's see what I had. I guess I don't have any more pictures. I was gonna so my main argument against his paper is that he says, well, they found these 2 cartouches of these 2 kings in this layer, which was before the Babylonian and Assyrian layers. The problem is neither of these cartouches say the word Ramses at all. The Egyptian kings had 5 titles, and the throne name um, was the title that was usually placed in the cartouche that you would find. So both of those are partial cartouches, meaning they didn't even find the entire thing unbroken. But they say Uzurmat Ra Mariamun for the Ramses III one, and Uzurmat Ra Setep in Amun for the second, for Ramses IV. And it happens that there were multiple kings of the 22nd and 23rd dynasties who used the same exact throne names. So the archaeologists have assumed that these were the cartouches of Ramses III and the Fourth because they think this was before the late period when they put the 22nd dynasty. When we would argue that it actually, the 22nd dynasty is the one that preceded the Ramessides, and the Ramessides were copying an older 22nd dynasty throne name instead of the other way around. And so when Ioko wrote this paper, since he was trying to disprove David Down, and David Down placed the 22nd dynasty before the Assyrian destruction, he should have at least recognized this as an issue and engaged with it, but he didn't. He just ignored it. So we would say that these are actually the cartouches probably of Shoshank III and possibly Osorkon II, Osorkon III, or Petubast I, all of whom used the same exact throne name as Ramses IV. So that's our answer to that. And you know, the part of the problem with the 20th dynasty and the 21st as well is that they are extremely scarce in terms of external synchronisms. This is especially true of the 21st dynasty, where there's practically no external synchronisms. The Ramses III major sea battles against these sea peoples in the Peliset is the strongest synchronism there is for that whole dynasty. And Velikovsky really treated it in such detail that it's a very strong argument. The only way to really dismiss his argument is with the hand waving that it couldn't possibly be. Basically, it's impossible. It contradicts what we already believe. But we've gone to do all the work to show that these prior placements of these dynasties fit very well and are justifiable. And once you get to that point, if we can nail the end of the 19th dynasty to 525 BC, then the 20th dynasty has to come sometime after it in either the Persian occupation, the satrapy, or the Hellenistic period. And we think that it actually overlaps both of those.
Gotcha. So just to remind my viewers, because I know these, getting these numbers straight can be overwhelming. The dynastic numbers, they're numbered according to their listing in the summaries of Manetho that we have from ancient authors, and in Velikovsky's construction, the end of the 18th dynasty, at least insofar as it is ended by contemporary scholars, is followed by dynasties 22 to 25, which is then followed in turn by dynasty 19 and 26. And Velikovsky identifies those two, and Ken Yu and Daryl White have not identified them, but placed them in very close and contemporaneous relationships. So remember, folks, Ken on his academia page has a chart where you can consult this and look at all that in case the numbers are just blowing you back and you're not following it all. So we've mentioned now Ramses III. Ramses III is identified by conventional scholars as kind of the last flowering or the last gasp of the New Kingdom, and he then immediately precedes Egyptian decline, which becomes the third intermediate period. Ramses III has also had a kind of controversial place in revisionist literature. So obviously Velikovsky identified Shishak, who sacked Jerusalem, as Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty. Rohl has identified Shishak as Ramses II under his throne name Sheshi, which he believes was corrupted into Shishak. And then Peter James, who at one point was an adherent of the Rohl chronology, slightly modified it and has identified Shishak with Ramses III. So that's a 10th century placement. You obviously have placed him in the fourth century. We've talked a little bit about the placement of the 20th dynasty in the fourth century, but what's the fourth century context for Ramses III, and how could you have a pharaoh who is of sufficient power to be conventionally identified as the last gasp of the new kingdom ruling in the period where the Achaemenids ruled the world?
So the Achaemenids, they basically had a civil war after the death of Darius II, and you had younger brother Cyrus, who is trying to um, take the throne with an army, and the Persians had to pull all their army out of Egypt to go fight the army that's coming out of Anatolia toward them. Um, and that gave the Egyptians the chance to basically get the Persians out and then fortify against them coming back. And the Persians are ruling a very, very large empire, and it really was. It took it took them about 50 years to more than 50 years. No, it was about 50 years before they really were able to come back, and they finally reconquered Egypt. They only reconquered it a short while before Alexander the Great came and um, defeated them and conquered the Persian Empire. So there is a window. There's definitely a window for dynasties 29 through 31 where the Egyptians were free. They were ruling themselves, and their main issue was fighting among themselves because those three dynasties kept assassinating each other. Um, but the possibility is very much there. And when you look at the Ramesside inscription for the big battles that he had at the mouth of the Nile, they do perfectly fit the history of Nectanebo the First and what happened. What happened at first was the Persians had kind of made a peace agreement with him, and possibly even were using him as mercenaries to fight a different enemy. So some of his battles show him as an ally of both what looked like the Sea People and the Persians, or the Peliset. Um, and then in a different set of these basically big pictures showing depicting the battles, the um, the Persians are now against him. The Peliset are now the enemy, and it looks like the Sea Peoples are fighting on the side of the Persians, and that is what happened. The Persians basically bribed the Greek mercenaries to come over to their side. And then there also was some Greeks who came at the end, and I guess this was later on after the murder of Ramses III. One of the Spartan kings actually came with his army to help uh, the Egyptians, and they didn't treat him well, and he basically ended up taking the sides of one of two Egyptian factions because the Egyptians split and had a little civil war. And Velikovsky describes all this. He goes through these points point by point. So we have a very strong Greek connection to the 20th dynasty. You also have as I mentioned, on the back of the tiles at Medinet Habu, where these murals are found. The murals were made out of these tiles, and on the back of a lot of the tiles are Greek letters. And apparently, the tiles were made in a Greek city there in Egypt, where they basically were manufacturing things. And that was known also that's known from the so-called late period, that there were these Greek colonies where the Greeks ran little cities and ran little factories in Egypt, and they were basically there under the sponsorship of the Egyptian king. So that part fits. There's another part that fits. The Ethiopians in Napata, around the fourth and third century, they're using identical throne names to the Ramessides and the some of the 22nd dynasty kings, which suggests that they were either contemporary or shortly after them. And that has been noted by Peter James, as you and I discussed earlier. That's a strong local connection, suggesting that the 20th dynasty does belong to basically the Hellenistic period, the Persian and the Hellenistic period.
Okay, so one of the interesting things that you've suggested tentatively um, is that Alexander the Great may appear under a different throne name in Manetho's king list. So for my viewers, that way the Ramside kings are identified as coming from Dynasty 19, where Ramses the First is the first king of that dynasty. Then there's Ramses the Second, Ramses the Great. We've just discussed Ramses the Third, and then you have lots and lots of other Ramsides who nobody really cares about. So you've identified tentatively Alexander the Great as possibly one of these kings. Could you just explore how you go about making that argument, and the degree of confidence with which you assess it, and how you've gotten there?
Okay. We're we haven't come down. We haven't published this in a paper yet, so it's still research and there's still a couple possibilities. But if Ramses the third and the fourth were Nectanebo 1 and 2, then you have about 38 years after the death of Nectanebo 2 until the conquest of Alexander the Great. There's from a temple, a number of letters were found called the late Ramesside letters, which help us to understand how many years each of these kings reigned. And they do seem to have had mostly short reigns. When Alexander was crowned in Egypt, when he first arrived, he was declared king. He declared himself king of Egypt, and he was welcomed as a liberator from the Persians. But he went to Alexandria, said, "I'm founding a city of Alexandria," and then he continued from there to the Siwa Oasis, and it took him a couple months to get there because he had to ride across the desert. He gets there, and of Amun in the Siwa Oasis was viewed similarly to the Oracle of Delphi. Um, Foreign kings would consult this oracle um, about what they should do and various questions. So he wanted to ask the oracle if the murderers of his father had all been killed, because he knew that his father had been assassinated, but he wasn't sure if he'd actually punished the right people. He also was curious whether he apparently suspected that he might be a son of Zeus, um, the god. So he wanted to ask the oracle about that too, and the oracle, being a very clever fellow, said, "Oh yes, your father's murderers were all killed, but that's not your real father's. Amun is your real father." And so that he took that as confirmation that he was the son of Zeus, and therefore he was a demigod. And that was very important to him. Well, that occurred probably in February of the year 331, because he got there in the fall of 332. So early winter 331, he gets to the oracle. He then traveled to Memphis, and it took him about 4 to 6 weeks to get to Memphis. And there in Memphis, he went through an Egyptian coronation ritual, which would mean that he was being recognized as a pharaoh of whatever dynasty that they had. And we do know from one inscription that his throne name was Setepen-Ra Meri-Amun. And that is actually two of the same phrases that are found in all the ones we were just discussing of Ramses 3 and 4. And that happens to be identical to the throne name of Ramses 7. Well, almost identical. He has an extra phrase, Uzurmatra Setepen-Ra Meri-Amun. And so that's a possibility of Ramses 7, but we suspect that actually Ramses the 10th is a better fit. Ramses 10, he has a precise date of coronation recorded, and it's a Sothic date, and this is in a time period that we know that Sothic dates actually did work. And it turns out that it was the early spring, if you use it for the year 331. And so the date and time of the date of his coronation matches the time of year for Ramses 10. And Ramses 10, his highest known year was 9. He only reigned 9 years, but he doesn't seem to have been there. There's very little evidence that he did anything in Egypt, and his tomb was never used. So Alexander, after spending 6 months in Egypt, he gets crowned pharaoh and he leaves and he goes to conquer the Persians and ends up spending, several years running around Babylon, trying to conquer India, trying to conquer Bactria. and he finally dies 9 years after he left Egypt. And so the 9 years reign of Ramses X fits, the time of year of the coronation fits, and the fact that he never used the tomb fits because after Alexander died, the four generals were basically fighting over his body because the Macedonians believed that the proof that you were the true successor to the king was that you basically buried him and sealed his tomb. And so one of the generals was trying to take the body of Alexander back to Macedonia, and it was intercepted in Syria by Ptolemy the First. Ptolemy basically stole the body of Alexander, took it back to Egypt, and he had a new tomb built for it in Alexandria. And that is where Alexander was buried. And that was also around I guess maybe 10 years later, Ptolemy started claiming the title King of Egypt. So he at first wasn't claiming that title, but then he started claiming it later. So the next in the series after Ramses X is Ramses XI, and he's the last one to ever build a tomb in the Valley of Kings. And remember that almost everything that archaeology knows about dynasties 19 and 20 comes from the Valley of Kings. It's their tombs that tell us most of what we know about them. There are some other things like stelae that are found in various places, but most of the narrative information comes from tombs and temples. So Ramses XI is the last one to have a tomb cut for him in the Valley of Kings. But his tomb, instead of being buried in that tomb, he wasn't buried there either. That tomb was used as a workshop by apparently the priest, what's his name? The priest of the 21st dynasty, who were rewrapping the mummies. What they were doing is they were breaking into all the tombs of the older pharaohs. They were unwrapping the mummies and taking all the jewels, and then they were rewrapping the mummies and then putting them together in a mummy cache so that they would be safe from tomb robbers. And granted, that sounds like a reasonable, I guess, if they believed the pharaoh lived in the afterlife, but only if his mummy was intact, and they were horrified that tomb robbers kept breaking in and tearing up mummies to get jewels. There's a altruistic motive to save the poor pharaohs so that their afterlives aren't ruined by having their mummies destroyed, by basically taking all the jewels out of the mummies, and now the mummies won't be desecrated anymore. But that also makes whoever does that very rich. And I think that it's known that the 21st dynasty kings were the ones who were doing this. And I think that they were basically doing it under the sponsorship of Ptolemy the First, and that Ptolemy the First was the same person as Ramses the 11th, and that the reason they were using his tomb as the workshop to rewrap all these mummies is that he basically made a deal with the priests that he would get a cut, and that's how he was funding his war chest to go do his wars in Asia. So that's my theory on it. And of course, the reason why he never used the tomb is because once he buried Alexander's body in Alexandria, he of course wanted to be buried there too. And so the 20th, basically the Valley of Kings was retired and was no longer relevant as the place where the pharaohs would be buried. And with the Ptolemies came the new religion. They basically created a new religion, which was called the worship of Serapis, and it was basically a combination of Zeus with Amun, or maybe sorry, Zeus with Osiris, and that became very popular in the Delta. And so effectively Thebes, which had been, the temple of Amun, the Karnak temple, um, all of Thebes claimed to glory and power. It no longer had military power, it hadn't for centuries, but its power had been the temple of Amun. But now that effectively the religion of Serapis had replaced Amun, there really isn't. Thebes is now just, kind of like a museum. And so it lost its importance. And in my opinion, the reason the 20th dynasty effectively ended wasn't really that it ended. It's just that they no longer made tombs there anymore. And now you have basically the Ptolemaic dynasty has replaced them. That's, of course, very similar to Velikovsky's argument. The only thing that I added was possibly recognizing Alexander as Ptolemy 10 and, sorry, Ramses 10 and Ptolemy 1 as being Ramses 11. So that's our argument. It's not a perfect argument, but it's a plausible argument.
So we've been kind of treating dynasties 20 and 21 here as a unit. Would you be able to just briefly kind of clarify the distinction between dynasties 20 and 21?
Well, so Dynasty 21 is based in Tanis, and I believe that's so Manetho had gone from Dynasty 16 all the way to 20 as a straight series of kings of Thebes. And then 21st Dynasty 21 is the first where he changes the city to Tanis, and that's also a chronological break. So 21, in our view, does not follow 20. 21 was basically parallel with 20. That whether 20 was based in the main power base or whether it was based in Thebes, that's, I mean, we've discussed earlier the question of was Ramses III the same person as Nectanebo, or were there two kings, one in Upper Egypt and one in Lower? And we don't have real strong proof on that, but the 21st dynasty were kings in Tanis, which was one of the Delta cities, and they were effectively acting as the kind of like the stewards of the history of Egypt. Um, for example, Siamun is believed to be the last of the 21st dynasty king, and he's the one who basically signed a lot of the mummy band. When they rewrapped the mummies, they signed the bandages. They wrote stuff on the bandages that'll enable you to know who did it. Um, so the question is where to put the 21st dynasty, other than the evidence that they were rewrapping the mummies, and that fits the Ramses the 11th. The other proof that it belongs at this point in history after 19 is that one of the kings, I think it was Susen's the second, I could have it, it could be the first. One of the kings, his burial was found undisturbed and had never been robbed. It was in the Delta, and he had been buried in the sarcophagus of Merneptah of the 19th dynasty. So that means that the 21st dynasty absolutely has to come after the 19th. And so we, based on where we place the 19th, that means that the earliest the 21st dynasty could possibly be would be 525, and probably significantly later. So the 21st dynasty is hard because they don't have any inscriptions saying we had a battle with so and so, any foreign countries, which makes it harder to peg to anything.
Gotcha, gotcha. So I think one of the things that's really come out through our whole series, and which I hope people understand, is that the distinctive of yours and Daryl White's approach here is on its relationship to durations and information that is given to us from the writings of ancient chroniclers. Now, the period of the 20th and 21st dynasties was, at least the later 20th dynasty, was a relatively dark period in Egyptian history. But that said, would you say that there's any major lines of evidence from ancient chroniclers that would place dynasties 20 and 21 to the Persian and Hellenistic periods?
Um, we had some of the evidence. So Diodorus is the one who gave us the account of the battles of Nectanebo 1 and 2 against the Persians. So obviously he's an ancient chronicler. We have some, I guess, original contemporary documents. One of those is called the Harris Papyrus, and that is a papyrus written in the name of Ramses III, possibly by his son or his nephew, which tells the story of how these foreign Asiatics had been oppressing Egypt, and they had closed all the temples. They were overtaxing the people, and this leader named Setnacht drives them out and basically liberates Egypt. So that's the Harris Papyrus. The question is, where does that fit and what can we compare it to? Well, there's another letter called the Letter to Bagoas, which was written by the Jews of Elephantine to Bagoas, who was the Persian either governor or satrap of the Jerusalem area. in the year I think it was 407, um, that there had been this Egyptian rebellion against the Persians, and they had destroyed the Jewish temple in Elephantine. And the actual copy we have of this letter is the copy of the person who wrote it. It was found in his actual office, basically, the papyrus. And in the letter, he relates the backstory. He said when Cambyses came, all the temples of Egypt had been knocked down. And it's not clear if Cambyses is the one who knocked them down, or if it had been Nebuchadnezzar 40 years earlier, um, in basically 567, when he came in to help Amasis get back on the throne, but Amasis ended up getting killed. Well, apparently the Jewish temple was the only one the Persians did not knock down. And here at the end of this era, the Egyptians knocked it down. And the letter was requesting money to rebuild the temple. The reason this is very significant to the whole question is that it it's very similar in description of what the Harris Papyrus describes had happened to Egypt, with the temples having been desecrated. And there really are only two possible eras in Egyptian history where this could have happened. That would be the Persian satrapy. The other one being the Hyksos period. So the Hyksos were known to have knocked down or maybe they didn't knock them down, but they basically robbed all the temples and burned a lot of things. So the letter to Bagoas fits with the Harris Papyrus. But there's something else that also fits that's really interesting. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, I think it's chapter 29, he gives two prophecies, and they're dated in different years, but the first prophecy is longer, and he prophesies that somebody, doesn't say who, is going to desolate Egypt and carry them into captivity for 40 years, that Egypt will be desolate. And then the second prophecy that's added says that Nebuchadnezzar is going to get to strike Egypt and take it as payment for because he was denied the loot from Tyre, because the Egyptians were secretly supporting Tyre when Nebuchadnezzar was besieging it. Um, so what's interesting is that it appears that Nebuchadnezzar sacked Egypt during the civil war between Amasis and his predecessor, Hopra, but that Nebuchadnezzar didn't stay, and Amasis was said to be the richest Egyptian king ever by, I'm not sure, but it was Herodotus who said that. One of them said Amasis was the wealthiest of Egyptian kings. So you would think that, given that he reigned about 40 years and he was wealthy, he would have rebuilt all the temples if Nebuchadnezzar had knocked any of them down. But after Cambyses comes, and Cambyses is recorded to have killed the Apis bull. He did a lot of crazy things because he apparently was going crazy. He actually ended up, in the process of stabbing the Apis bull, he seems to have accidentally cut himself, and he later died from an infection from that wound. But anyway, the point is that the Persians definitely, at the beginning of their satrapy, were extremely cruel to the Egyptians, and there's record of that in the chroniclers. And then you have at the end of this time period, this rebellion by Amyrtaeus, where he is basically claiming that he drove out the Asiatics. Sorry, it's in the Harris Papyrus. It's Setnacht who says he drove out the Asiatics, and Setnacht could be a name for Amyrtaeus, or it could be a different person at the same who was a contemporary of Amyrtaeus. But the setting fits, the actions fit, of expelling these Asiatics who had been pillaging them for a long time. And then there's an element where it connects to the biblical history of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. These prophecies by Ezekiel and Jeremiah against Egypt were rooted in the fact that it was the Egyptians encouraging the king of Judah to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar that caused Nebuchadnezzar to come and besiege Jerusalem and destroy it. And the Egyptian kings who had been doing this, Hophra is specifically named in Jeremiah, Apries, who we would view as Marinepta. Um, he apparently was encouraging the Jewish king to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar, but then when Nebuchadnezzar came, he made a deal with him, and then came and helped him, defeat the Jews and carry them into captivity and conquer their cities. And of course, I've argued in the previous lecture that that was the Israel stele is actually Merneptah bragging about having uh, you know the deportation of the Jews, and that he then went and I think it was he sacked Ashkelon like the year after that, which is mentioned also in the book of Jeremiah. But Jeremiah prophesied about that too. So I think when Jerusalem was carried into captivity and the temple was destroyed, this prophecy was made that the Egyptians are going to suffer a similar fate, and their desolation will last 40 years. And we count that desolation as lasting from Cambyses' conquest of Egypt until the year that Xerxes um, faced the rebellion, and he apparently changed his title. He faced a rebellion in Babylon, and he stopped calling himself King of Babylon and started change his title to King of the Persians and the Medes. And that happened to be exactly 40 years after Cambyses sacked Egypt. So you had the 40-year desolation, and apparently Xerxes at that time sent his brother Achaemenes to Egypt to try to pacify the nation. And I think that was the time they brought back the Egyptian royal line who had been captive in Persepolis or somewhere else in empire. And it's very possible that brought back the woman known as Twa who was apparently had this guy named Chancellor Bey who is manipulating her. And we talked about in a previous episode that the Egyptian title of Chancellor Bey looks very similar to Achaementero or Achaemenes. So all that is to say, Egypt suffers this 40-year desolation, and then when Xerxes changes his title, it looks like they were allowed to have their royal line back. But Egypt did not get free of the Persians until the year after 405 BC, and 405 BC was 49 years from Artaxerxes' decree to rebuild Jerusalem. So there, and the prophecy in Daniel, I think chapter 9, says there's 70 weeks of sevens, and the first 7 sevens is the city being rebuilt. The city and it will be rebuilt with the streets and the wall. And it's very interesting to me that it looks like Egypt only finally got free of the Persians after Jerusalem had been completely rebuilt and that first 49 years was over. So that fits. I don't know if you would count that as the ancient chroniclers, but the story that we have from Ramses III and him telling the story of his father or grandfather, Setnacht, it matches and it fits together with the other information we have from that time period of what the Persians were doing, and the people of God and the rebuilding of Jerusalem and all this. It fits together and it meshes together pretty nicely.
So this discussion concludes our survey of your reconstruction of ancient Egyptian history and ancient history more broadly. So James Jordan has said that biblical history is the core and the center of world history. So for those who are interested in cashing out what that means concretely in ancient history, what are your final thoughts on where this conversation on revised chronologies needs to go? And how do you think young scholars or aspiring scholars can contribute in a methodologically responsible way to the project of a revised chronology?
Well, what Daryl and I have been working on for 15 years is to try to lay with these papers an academic foundation that would allow more work to be done. So once that work is finished, Others can extend it by writing histories, curricula, making videos. But there's also a lot of room for research. For example, we've shown that there are some very strong correlations between the so-called Hittites and the Medes. Um, and I think that there's a lot of rich ground to dig there and find further synchronisms that we didn't get to yet, just because we're having to cover such a huge span of history, but other people could focus in on closer on smaller windows and find a lot of supporting material that's there. Um, as for young academics, I'd say that if you decide you're going to pursue a higher academic degree in history or archaeology, you're going to be best served to keep your thoughts to yourself while you get your degree, because everything that we've talked about in these last 9 episodes is considered heresy by the established academic history and archaeology faculty and body of work. So once you're tenured, you can then have more freedom to pursue the research that you want to. But for now, if you want to go anywhere in academia, talking about this isn't going to help you. So I would say we really need basically people who are not academics to work, who are willing to do this as volunteers and as amateurs, and to basically continue to advance the field. And that's really been happening for the last 50 years. Roll and Peter James, and I guess Dr. Benson is a professional, but basically the revisionists have been going for 50 years since Velikovsky started this, and a lot of progress has been made and as a result of their work, even if they came to conclusions that like we don't agree with. Nevertheless, their research dug up a lot of information that's able to be used by other revisionists who are trying to come up with an integrated chronology that works with all the information. So that's all I could say at this point.
Yeah, yeah, and I think one of the things that um, people who maybe are skeptical of revisionism should keep in mind is, and we're going to talk about this more in future videos. Often you will hear things like, "Oh, well, nobody uses Sothic dating anymore," um, and well, that's great if it's true. It's not completely true, but it has been on the decline. But the question, is why has that been on the decline? Well, it's been in part because folks like Peter James, who were very careful and rigorous in their scholarship, uh, asked the conventional perspective to defend it. And there are plenty of honest, kind of, I think, well-intentioned people within the conventional academy, and then there are also some people who will go out to get you if you're if you're too radical. But there's enough that those criticisms do have an effect. And so when we hear things like, well, this is just, it's pseudoscience or pseudo-archaeology, or, I've heard roll, is just a joke. Well, if you actually read the reviews by people who are conventional Egyptologists, some of them will say that, others will say, well, it's kind of unfair to paint Roll with that brush because he does know the material. So I think the reality here is that revisionists are going to be held to a higher standard. It's important work that needs to be done. And I think we need to be kind of exceptionally careful to really meet that standard, so that when professional scrutiny does come, and that's a healthy thing, it can be engaged with in a responsible way. So I hope folks will see that engagement in some detail when we discuss David Falk's criticisms of many aspects of Ken's model. So in the next discussion, we are actually going to go far back in history to the period soon after the flood, and we are going to look at common themes in mythological traditions concerning ancient pantheons and see if we can learn anything from those traditions about what the real story is about humanity in the period that kind of divides history and mythology. So I'm really excited about that. And Ken, thank you so much for all of your work, both in doing these videos and in this project in general. So with that said, we will see you next time.
All right, see you soon.